Ask a pilot who flew the Lockheed Constellation what she was like, and you'll almost always get two answers in the same breath. She was the most beautiful machine they ever put their hands on, and she spent a good part of her life trying to kill them. Both of those things are true. That's the strange part. Most famous airplanes get remembered for one thing: fast or safe or tough or ugly. The Constellation gets remembered for being adored by the same men she frightened. You don't get many machines like that. So here's the question worth 13 minutes of your time. How does an airliner end up loved and feared in equal measure by the people who knew her best? And why, 70 years on, do old pilots still go a little quiet when you say her name? To answer that, we have to start with a millionaire who didn't want anyone to know what he was building. In 1939, Howard Hughes effectively controlled TWA, and Hughes wanted something no airline in the world had yet: a pressurized airliner that could cross the United States in a single hop, riding high above the weather, faster than anything else in the sky. He took that wish to Lockheed along with TWA's president, Jack Fry, and they did it in secret, real secret. The specifications were locked down, the program kept off the books, because Hughes had no interest in handing a rival the blueprint for the future. The story goes that early on, the engineers weren't even allowed to be told who the customer was. What Lockheed drew up was unlike anything flying. Look at almost every airliner of that era and you'll see a tube, a straight cylinder with wings bolted on. The Constellation refused to be a tube. Her fuselage curved along its whole length, thin at the nose, swelling through the middle, tapering away to the tail, the line of a dolphin more than a machine. People assumed it was vanity. It wasn't. That shape let the designers keep the airflow clean while still fitting a round, pressurized cabin inside. And a round cross-section is what you need when you're going to pump the cabin full of pressure and fly it up where the air is too thin to breathe. Beauty, in her case, was a byproduct of physics. Then there was the tail, not one fin, but three. Partly that was about control, keeping enough rudder authority if an engine quit on one side. But there was a more ordinary reason too. A single tall fin would have meant taller hangars, and the airlines already had hangars. Three smaller fins kept her height down, so she'd fit through the doors they already owned. It's a very practical answer to a very expensive problem, and it happened to give her one of the most recognizable silhouettes in aviation. You can identify a Connie from a mile off, in a child's drawing, by that triple tail alone. All of this cost money. That curved fuselage was a nightmare to build, because almost no two frames along its length were the same. Every section was its own shape, its own jig, its own headache on the factory floor. Lockheed knew it. They built her anyway because Hughes and Fry were chasing something the straight tube crowd couldn't match. And for a while, they got it. And then the war took her. The Constellation first flew in January of 1943, out of Burbank. But by then, America was deep into the Second World War, and a fast, long-legged, pressurized aircraft was exactly what the Army Air Forces wanted for themselves. So the first Connies didn't go to TWA. They went into olive drab as the C-69 military transports. The airline that ordered them left, waiting at the back of the line. Hughes was not the kind of man to wait quietly. In the spring of 1944, he and Jack Fry climbed into one of those military Constellations, had it painted up in TWA's colors for the cameras, and flew it from Burbank to Washington in under 7 hours, coast to coast, faster than it had ever been done by an airliner. They touched down at the capital, having dragged the whole continent closer together in an afternoon, and they made sure every newspaper in the country knew it. Officially, it was a military aircraft on a government errand. In practice, it was the loudest sales pitch in aviation history. Hughes was telling the airlines and the public exactly what was coming the moment the shooting stopped. When it did stop, the Constellation became the airplane that shrank the world. Think about what flying actually meant before her. You flew low in the weather, not above it. You got bounced around through every storm between you and your destination. Crossing the country meant stops, and crossing an ocean meant a long, cold, anxious haul in something that couldn't climb away from the rough air. The Connie changed the arithmetic. Pressurized, she could climb to 20,000 feet and leave the storms beneath her. Fast, she could cross the Atlantic in a single night and the continent without the old chain of fuel stops. TWA put her over the ocean in 1946. Pan Am flew her. Suddenly, the rich and the famous, and the merely impatient, could have dinner in New York and breakfast in Paris, and the idea of an ocean as a barrier started to dissolve. Inside, she was a different world from what came before. Real cabins, real meals, berths you could sleep in on the long runs, the hum of the engines somewhere out beyond the windows instead of right in your lap. For a brief, glamorous stretch of years, flying the Constellation was the most modern thing a human being could do, and the airline sold that glamour for everything it was worth. She wasn't just transport, she was the future, painted silver, parked on the ramp where everyone could see her. But we started this with two answers, didn't we? The beautiful one and the deadly one. Here's the deadly one. Bolted to those graceful wings were four Wright-R 335O engines. 18 cylinders each, packed in two tight rows, enormous power for the time, and a temperament that bordered on malice. This was the same basic engine family that had tormented the B-29 bomber during the war, an engine with a well-earned habit of overheating, and worse, of catching fire. Crews learned to watch it the way you'd watch a pan of oil on a hot stove. The Constellation could fly higher and farther than almost anything in the sky, and she could do it on engines that wanted, at the worst possible moment, to burn. So, pilots flew her with one part of their mind always on those four temperamental giants, and the man who carried that weight most of all sat behind them, the flight engineer. On the Connie, he was not a passenger to the drama. He was the one reading the cylinder head temperatures, nursing the fuel mixtures, leaning the engines just enough for range, but not so much that they cooked themselves, listening for the wrong note in the roar. A good flight engineer on a Constellation was the difference between a long, quiet night over the Atlantic and a very loud one. Pilots will tell you, decades later, that they trusted certain engineers with their lives in a way that didn't translate to words. The crews had a joke about it, and like the best jokes, it was mostly true. They called her the best three-engine airliner in the world, because so often, somewhere over the ocean or the desert, one of those four would have to be shut down and feathered, the propeller turned edge on to the wind, and the Connie would press on home on the remaining three. She did it well. She did it a lot. The joke was affectionate, and it was a warning at the same time, which is exactly the kind of thing you say about a machine you love and don't entirely trust. And here's what the numbers don't capture. Flying her was work. Real, physical, sweating work. No computers, no autopilot worth the name on the early ships. No soft electronic hands smoothing out your mistakes. You flew the Constellation with your arms and your feet and your judgment. 4 throttles and 4 propeller controls, and 4 mixture levers under your hands. And you managed all of it while keeping a heavy, fast, beautiful airplane pointed at a runway you couldn't always see. The men who were good at it were proud of being good at it, the way a sailor is proud of a difficult boat. That pride is most of the reason they still miss her. She asked them for everything, and flying her well meant you actually were something. For a few years, she reigned, and Lockheed kept making her better. The Super Constellation stretched the body longer and hung even more powerful engines on the wings. Turbo compound monsters that squeezed extra horsepower out of the exhaust itself. Brilliant and complicated and, yes, even harder to keep happy. Then came the Starliner, the final, longest-legged version. An airplane that could fight its way non-stop across the Atlantic against the headwinds, flying some of the longest scheduled routes the world had ever seen. At her peak, the Constellation could carry you almost anywhere that mattered, in a kind of comfort the previous generation could only dream about. She even carried presidents. Dwight Eisenhower's Constellation was called the Columbine, and it's there, aboard a Connie, that one of the most famous phrases in the world was born. In 1953, the president's Constellation was in the air near another aircraft, a commercial flight, and the two happened to be using nearly the same identifying number over the radio. The confusion was dangerous enough that something had to change. From then on, whenever the president was aboard, his aircraft would use a single unmistakable call sign, so that no one ever again could mix it up with an airliner. That call sign was Air Force One. It started with a Constellation. So, picture where she stood in the middle of the 1950s. The most elegant airliner in the sky. The presidential aircraft. The machine that had folded up the oceans and the continents and handed them to anyone with the price of a ticket. If you'd stood on a ramp then and watched a Super Constellation taxi out, props turning, that long, curved body catching the light, you'd have been forgiven for thinking she'd rule the skies for a generation. She had about 3 years left, because while the Connie was at her absolute peak, the jets were coming. The Boeing 707 entered service in 1958, the Douglas DC-8 right behind it, and the jet didn't just beat the Constellation, it made her irrelevant almost overnight. A jet flew higher, smoother, nearly twice as fast, with no propellers to manage and no temperamental fire-prone radials to nurse across an ocean. The thing that had made the Connie magical, that she could fly above the weather and cross the sea in a night, the jet simply did better, and did it while the passengers sat in a quiet that the piston age could never offer. The work the flight engineer sweated over all night, the jet age slowly automated away. The fall was brutal in its speed. An airplane that had been the proudest thing on the ramp became, within a handful of years, the old equipment. The Constellations got pushed down the ladder, off the glamour routes, onto the charters, then into cargo, hauling freight in the dark on the runs the jets didn't want. Some ended up flying for operators most passengers had never heard of, in corners of the world, far from where they'd once landed presidents and movie stars. And then, one by one, they stopped flying at all. Lines of them sat parked in the dry desert air, those triple tails in a row, waiting for a buyer who mostly never came until the scrappers arrived. It's a hard ending for any machine. It was a harder one for the men who'd flown her, because they knew exactly what was being thrown away. Not just an airplane, a way of flying, a craft that demanded real skill and rewarded it, that asked the pilot and the engineer to be genuinely good and made them feel it when they were. The jet was better. Nobody who's honest argues otherwise. But better isn't the same as loved, and you don't weep for a machine that was merely efficient. That's the thing the numbers will never quite explain. Ask one of the few left who flew her, and they won't lead with how fast she was or how far she reached. They'll tell you about the sound of those 4 engines settling into a cruise over a dark ocean, about a flight engineer who could read trouble in a gauge before it became a fire, about the feel of all that beauty and all that danger balanced under their own 2 hands, and the quiet pride of bringing her home on 3 when she'd had enough of 4. She was the most beautiful machine they ever flew, and she spent her life trying to kill them. Both true. And if you ever wondered how an airplane earns that kind of love, the answer is the same as it is for people. It's never the easy ones we remember. It's the ones who asked everything of us and made us better for it. That was the Lockheed Constellation, the world's best 3-engine airliner, and the last great airplane that truly had to be flown.